From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congress passes a provision to prevent the president from leaving the NATO alliance. Is this aimed at former and possibly future President Trump? And is this the kind of provision that can work? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Kim Strassel. The National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, is about 1,000 pages this year, and some new spotlight being shined on a small provision and a limitation on withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Here's what it says. The president shall not suspend, terminate, denounce, or withdraw the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty, done at Washington, D.C., April 4th, 1949, except by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur or pursuant to an act of Congress. This is a provision that was not very much noticed when it got into this bill. But let's start with a clip of Virginia Senator Tim Kaine arguing that it was needed back in July.
What this amendment would do would make plain that no one could withdraw from NATO, the United States from NATO, without either a 2/3 vote in the Senate or an act of Congress. We've received a green light for this in the Goldwater v. Carter decision in 1979. And I think of all the treaties that the U.S. has entered into, right now at this moment, this Congress should send a powerful message to our allies in NATO that we stand with this historic alliance. The administration supports this amendment.
And here is Senator Roger Wicker wondering who Tim Kaine might mean when he says that no one may withdraw from NATO.
I cannot think of any currently serving elected official of significance who's calling for suspending or withdrawing from NATO. If I didn't know better, I would think that this amendment might be aimed as a slap at former President Trump, but surely that is not the case. If it is, however, we should be reminded that the former president was concerned about some of NATO's members not meeting their obligations to spend 2% of GDP, but that he was fully committed to Article 5 of NATO.
Kate, what do you make of this? And is there any doubt that this provision is aimed at the former president, who is now the leading Republican candidate in the 2024 primaries?
So this provision sponsored by Tim Kaine and Marco Rubio, I think some of its drafters will tell you that they are legitimately concerned about Congress's role in deciding the nation's foreign policy. Now, of course, a president pondering NATO and whether it's worth our time. Who could that be? Yes, of course, Donald Trump comes immediately to mind. And this effort to expand Congress's role in potentially withdrawing from NATO has been going on in Congress for years and dates back to still when Trump was in office. Cory Gardner, who was a Republican from Colorado who lost his reelection bid, was originally a part of it. So I do think it, of course, is about Trump, who had some legitimate complaints about some of our friends in Europe, as Roger Wicker alluded to in the clip. But I also do think, we shouldn't lose sight here about that there is a left-right condominium that is very skeptical of America's role in the world and thinks that we'd be better served by retreating into our own domestic interests. So it really could be a Democratic president who's the next one who thinks NATO is not valuable. This moment in time we're living in where the Democrats are supporting Ukraine because the country's become so partisan and polarized is not guaranteed to last forever, and it's not even perhaps how things will look several years from now. So I think it does have value regardless of who it is perhaps addressing at the current moment.
Kim, I think this is notable as a moment of bipartisanship in Congress. Kate mentions, I think rightly, that there is a left-right condominium calling for America to withdraw from the world, but it does seem to me like there is still a left-right bipartisan majority agreeing that that is the wrong direction to go. And notable that one of the sponsors of this amendment was not only Tim Kaine, the Democratic senator from Virginia, but Marco Rubio, the Republican from Florida. Here is part of what he said. The Senate should maintain oversight on whether or not our nation withdraws from NATO. We must ensure we are protecting our national interests and protecting the security of our democratic allies. And so, Kim, notable to me that this seems to be a bit of preparation in case President Trump does win the 2024 election and voted in the affirmative by both parties.
I'd say preparation in case any future president gets there, because I think, as Kate mentioned, you have seen this growing strain of isolationism percolating in both parties. And what you have at the moment, and it's not just happening in terms of NATO, but I think in a number of other areas, we're seeing it in the Ukraine funding fight, the Israel funding fight. You have this left-right condominium of people who understand what a moment of peril we are at in the moment globally, and the importance of leading on that issue. Because we know from long history, you look at the United States, there is a little bit of a siren song at times, especially when economic times are not good. You get a little bit more populist politicians who come along and they talk about the America First proposition. We shouldn't be spending money overseas. We've made that mistake in the past, and those memories should be long. We took our eyes off the ball in Europe in the last century and ended up in 2 world wars over it. And I think it's wise of this cooler heads in Congress to now be trying to take a very definitive step this way. So it's notable the people that have come together, and that still comprises, I think, a significant majority of the Congress. But I think to Kate's point, you're seeing it obviously in Donald Trump. You see it, I think, a little concerningly in some of the other Republican primary candidates who have wanted to follow his lead. So now you have Ron DeSantis, for instance, whenever he's asked a question about Ukraine, his first answer is, well, the Europeans need to be doing more. This is sort of in the same pathway. But you see it as well among progressives, who some of them might be pulled along, dragging and kicking in the president's support of Ukraine right now, but it's not their natural inclination. And in fact, the party has long been far more tentative about engaging in overseas cooperative defense. And so I think that this is a good guard against both of those sides and impulses.
Well, to my eye, Donald Trump seems to be going farther on NATO than that clip of Roger Wicker suggested. Let's listen to Trump in a Truth Social video in March talking about the U.S.'s relationship with the alliance.
We have to finish the process we began under my administration of fundamentally reevaluating NATO's purpose and NATO's mission. Our foreign policy establishment keeps trying to pull the world into conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia based on the lie that Russia represents our greatest threat. But the greatest threat to Western civilization today is not Russia. It's probably, more than anything else, ourselves and some of the horrible USA-hating people that represent us.
Kate, what do you make of the complaints that President Trump has issued over the years about NATO and its funding structure in particular?
That's really been Donald Trump's core complaint, which is that the U.S. contributes too much, is what he says. Okay, so let's get into that a little bit. I've written about the neglect of European defense spending. Most recently, there was a report out of British Parliament about how Britain's Air Force is basically a small boutique force that would be unable to last in any sort of peer conflict. Britain has like an obligation to provide like an overhead orbit for NATO, for instance, kind of a binoculars in the sky, but they retired all the planes that are supposed to do that, and replacements haven't arrived yet. So European defense neglect is a real and serious issue. But on the other hand, what Donald Trump is usually complaining about is that the European countries don't meet their commitment to spend at least 2% of their economy on defense. And while that's true, we are up to 11 of 31 meeting the commitment. Iceland has no military, and that is up from 3 of 31 in 2014 when the kind of guideline agreement was made. That's an improvement. Another thing is that this proxy is a rough proxy for investing in defense, but that has asterisks too. I mean, the one of the 3 who met the 2% guideline in 2014 was Greece. So you can meet the 2% guideline by having a sluggish economy, for instance. But more substantively than that, the U.S. spends about 3% of its economy on its defense, and that is not charity. That's not money we spend or just flows to Europe. In fact, most of that money goes to other parts in the world in our own national defense. So this idea that we would cut our own defense spending to show Europe we mean business is very self-defeating. I don't know that that's what Trump is really arguing. I think he's just expressing a frustration that the Europeans have let their defenses atrophy to this point of real embarrassment. But I think the idea that we don't get something for our defense spending or that it's wasted on Europe is really not the true picture of what goes on with our NATO commitments.
Well, I don't begrudge any president for pushing Europe to get its defense act in order, but there's still, as Kate suggests, a U.S. interest here. And Kim, the phrase that comes to my mind is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And those numbers, it may look like the U.S. is carrying more than its fair share of freight for NATO. On the other hand, that still is probably cheaper than what would result if Russia continued to sense weakness in Europe and decided that it wanted to march in the Baltics one day.
Yeah, let's just look at that Ukraine example. And let's be very clear. It was Joe Biden's signal of weakness with our withdrawal in Afghanistan that traces a straight line from that moment to Putin being emboldened enough to invade Ukraine. You can actually see him beginning to mass troops along Ukraine's borders in phony training exercises around the time Biden decided to pull us out of Afghanistan. Now, imagine what the signal would be to a Putin if we put forward any suggestion that they were going to abandon or walk away from NATO. Right now, the very threat of that united defense, because of course that is what the pact requires, is that an invasion of one NATO country mobilizes the entire alliance. That is what is keeping Putin in check at the moment. And we can't be sure that even that will be keeping him in check. So what's called for at the moment is a doubling down of commitment to NATO. And that also does require the Europeans to get their act together. And I would note that to a certain extent, they are trying to do so. Obviously, more of them now, as noted, 11 of the 31 are meeting that goal. There's talk about turning that goal actually into a requirement. You've got countries like Germany, who Olaf Scholz, prime minister, has now promised to double the military budget there. You've got certainly a lot of Eastern European countries that are growing their own commitment even bigger than what they have now, many of those who already meet the commitment. And there's a lot of pressure that's being exerted on the laggards to get with it. So I'm hopeful that we may see some bigger changes in Europe. This would be exactly the wrong time as a result for the United States to be looking any weaker on it.